Hey, Miguel Iturrate here for the CRP, and I am back with Chadillac. And we're going to address the Chael Sonnen situation right now. Chael obviously came off his Lyoto Machida loss and went ahead and retired. And journalist Luke Thomas put out, I didn't see anything wrong with it. Luke kind of defended himself and said he didn't see anything wrong with it. But he put out a retro, so to speak, on Chael Sonnen's career. And Chael seems to have taken offense a little bit, saying he was called good, not great, and is he great, and stuff like that. So I guess we're making this CRP podcast to tell both of them the way it really is. Right, Jack?
Yeah, I think it's something like that. And listen, for those of you listening right now, before we get started on anything else, I'm peeved on this. I've got to talk about it. It's important stuff in the MMA world. I went to see Rocket Man, and that is not a movie. It's a musical, which is bullshit. I just want to say that. I don't like it. I'm not happy with it. If I want to see a musical, I'll watch Across the Universe. Okay, Miguel, go ahead, please. I don't even like Les Miserables.
To wrap that up real fast for the fans, and basically he said, I saw Rocket Man. I asked him if he saw Kim Jong-il because I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. So, just so that you guys know. But getting back to Chael Sonnen and Luke Thomas.
Okay, so here's what happened, okay? So listen, Chael Sonnen, okay, we all know Chael Sonnen retired, all that stuff. He lost to Machida, which was a really crappy way for him to retire. But, what's he going to do? I mean, he was clearly completely outclassed in that from start to finish. He looked really bad in the fight. And we both kind of know Chael in a weird way. You more so than me. My Chael experience is something that we can get into and we can talk about, and we'll see what Chael has to say about it. If he responds to this, that's up to him. I don't care. But
I doubt it. Hey, here's what's going to happen.
I doubt that Chael's going to respond to anything I say, but I can tell you this for a fact. Chael and I had a confrontation about what it took to be a superstar, and he vehemently disagreed with me on every level, so much so that I pulled the vehicle over outside of Trenton, New Jersey, on a bypass and said, fuck it. If you want, we can step out and settle this now. I was that pissed off about it. Chael was in the very back. Obviously, I was in the very front. We were going to do medicals and that kind of thing. This is a long time ago in another organization that I worked with. And in so doing, the argument was over whether or not fighters needed to act more, that they needed to characterize themselves the way they do, say, in wrestling. And Chael argued with me that is absolutely the wrong way to go. And by the way, we've been arguing politics because he's a staunch conservative. I'm a far left liberal. And so we had been talking back and forth about these things. And so no matter what I said, Chael was going to argue against that whatever that process that I was talking about was. He was going to argue against it. So what happened was this then. I told Chael, I said, if you guys want to have a job next month, then you'd better get out there tomorrow night and talk on the microphone and make people care about what you're doing, or you will not have a job. And it is that simple. This is the last shot. This is the last gas. This is a great opportunity. You all know it. And if you don't do something about it, like characterize yourselves, be the bad guy, be the good guy, be Captain America, be Dr. Evil, whatever you need to be something besides another guy with a pair of gloves on. And Chael argued with me vehemently to the point where I pulled the vehicle over, the 16-passenger almost bus, and said, we can fucking settle it right now. And that is literally what happened. I doubt he even remembers. It's not a blip on his radar because I'm nobody and he's Chael Sonnen. and he gets 35 billion hits a week, and we've got 100 members. So hey,
that's what I was going to say. Basically, Luke Thomas and Chael, they may have talked about this last week and set the whole thing up so that each of them gets a million hits and they all get a check. We're going to try to take it seriously and talk about it here and really talk about Chael's legacy and what are we going to get? But we're going to do it at 11 and at a real legitimacy. And here's the bottom line: is I remember those incidents. I'm looking back at Chael's career here, and I actually was a matchmaker for him for 6 of his fights.
Yep.
So, and he went 6-0. And I normally don't matchmake easy for people. So
no, that's the farthest thing from what you would do. In fact, I would argue, Miguel, that you more often than not were the guy who could possibly ruin a man's career than make it, because if they didn't have the goods in the ring, you didn't give a shit what they had outside of the ring.
Well, yeah, and the bottom line is especially in terms of a 6-fight winning streak and the way MMA was in that time, and he didn't have a 6-fight. Chael, I think, started off 6-0 in his career. If you look at Sherdog, there was a lull there. There may have been some fighting between 97 and 2001 that's undocumented there. Yeah. But he's got 2 5-fight winning streaks, and I was the matchmaker during one of those 5-fight winning streaks. He fought Alexei Oleinik in there, who's now a UFC veteran and a heavyweight who's been climbing the rankings until I think he recently lost to Valentin Overeem or Valentin Overeem, Alistair Overeem. Yeah, I'm having flashbacks.
Overeem's almost as old as Ivel.
Yeah, but that's the point. Is Oleinik's been around. He beat Alexei Oleinik, who's in the UFC. He beat Tim McKenzie, who's relatively tough, and he beat Amar Suluev. Who later on he would also go on to beat Amar Sulev's teammate, who was Arman Gambarian, or actually he fought Gambarian beforehand. So I know him pretty well, and during this time, that's the time that you had the conversation with him, and you're right. This time he was definitely a staunch, I'm a wrestler, I'm a competitor, and the competition speaks for himself. He was soft-spoken. He was quiet. I know he was taking it all in, and I know I knew he was smart from the beginning. He was definitely. I would describe him as aloof. But the thing about Chael from those time periods is he showed up with real quality people like Robert Follis. May he rest in peace. But Follis was more often than not his corner man. So He had backing and he had a team around him and stuff. And then, like I said, aloof. I'll tell you a story. I think it was one of the weigh-ins against Gambarian in Florida, in Jersey. This may have been the same weekend of your conversation with him. He was at the weigh-ins. He didn't show up. We had to go to his room and get him, and he was playing video games. And then he kind of wanted it known. His coach came down and told us, and he wanted. It seemed like he wanted Gambarian to know he was playing video games, like he wasn't taking it seriously. And he was in Gambarian's head by the time the fight happened. It really was that simple. Chael would show up, and he's a good-looking kid, at the time, and he's a big kid, but he'd show up just in a white T-shirt and jeans at the weigh-ins, and hands in his pocket, like real, like quiet, and Gambarian and those guys were not impressed at all in the very beginning and stuff. And I remember we did a ring ceremony where all the fighters lined up in the ring and faced their opponents, and we did the national anthems and stuff. And I remember very specifically the American team, was there, and they're a mishmash, and the Russians were all dressed the same, and they were all lined up and stuff like that. And Chael was an interesting case there, because if I remember his body language correctly, during the Russian national anthem, Chael was holding the rope and just looking around at the crowd and just not paying attention. He wasn't even lined up with the team, the American team. But when the American anthem went on, he kind of snapped to attention. Yeah. And when he came out of his corner to fight Gambarian, he winked at him. So he kind of dominated the fight, right? So I think and there to me, I could talk about a real progression he made in his fighting there, where he was fighting tough people. Gambarian was a tough guy. He fought Gambarian for 3 rounds. He put him in top control in the crucifix, sitting on his stomach and controlling both arms with, an arm between the legs and the other arm here, and he's got a hand free. And he beat the tar out of him, but he beat the tar out of him for 3 rounds. And he got him in that position every round. By the time he had fought Suluev, who Suluev was basically a little better than Gambarian. Suluev was a UFC veteran at that point, and same style as Gambarian, but Suluev had cut his teeth and was better. But he flattened Suluev, and in the second round, in that crucifix, he smashed him with elbows and took him out. And that's progression to me, So I saw a lot of that, and that's why, I had him back 6 times on my shows. I thought he was a guy with potential and that you could build off of, because he was quiet, not doing a lot of the work, on the mic and stuff. At the time, I had him lined up, for a future champion kind of thing with Bodog. And that's the honest truth. At the time, I was working with Trevor. Trevor Prangley was the champion that we had that won the belt against Yuki Kondo. And him and Chael had fought before.
And they had a lot in common.
Yeah, and that's the point, is that really is a stalemate fight. You know what I mean? And that could go either way, and I just didn't want to see it again. You know what I mean? Especially not for the belt, especially because, at times both guys could be criticized for being a little boring. I think that's when they were trying to win, I was avoiding doing Prangley versus Sonnen. I had kind of Sonnen waiting in the wings, and what I wanted to do was Prangley versus Matt Lindland, who was Sonnen's teammate. And I remember this era, and Chael got the job done every time. But as far as on the mic and stuff, he was reticent and not himself. So now when I see him now, I see a completely different person.
Yep. That's why I say the day that I had that conversation with Chael is the day that he changed. And you're right, that was the night of that fight. And it happened to also be the second to last show that Bodog did, if I remember correctly.
Okay, so I see what it is. Is he did fight Suluev in Jersey? I had to go back to the Euphoria days for Jersey. I forgot that we did the Alvarez and Lee fight in Jersey, and I remember that. Yeah. That was a great show. Actually, that was a great show that nobody except some Eddie Alvarez fans saw.
Yeah. So there were a few Eddie Alvarez fans in Indiana. If you knew David Love, you watched it. He beat Oroso, maybe was his name. The kid with the big 0 on his chest. But anyway.
It's not 0. It's an O. His last name is an O.
Sorry.
But you're right. It's not a cool tattoo. It's not a good tattoo, kid. Hopefully not some decorations on that or something. But,
good kid, though. Tough fighter. But those were early days of fighting. And people don't understand a lot of times now. It's 2019. That was 2006, 7, right?
But let's get back to the point. So great.
I'm getting to the point. That's 12 years ago, basically, even 13 years ago. I don't recall for sure, but what I'm saying is that MMA had just broken loose. The MMA boom had just happened, and so because of that, there were only a few superstars in MMA. People didn't pay attention to it. They didn't care about it. And the only people who got attention in MMA were the people who did something, like Tank Abbott. Miguel always says, you get hit and you're on Queer Street and you hit them back and you wake up on Main. I go to the bar, they go have an IV. That kind of stuff. Tank was not that. He wasn't a very good fighter. He never beat anybody good, not really good. And I'm not taking anything away from Tank. I'm just saying, when it came right down to it, Tank never beat anybody that was really a very good, technically skilled fighter. He could only go in there and fight sluggers, swing with them, and beat them. In that case, he won some fights. And I would never argue the idea that Tank definitely was exceedingly important in helping build the UFC and MMA today. But he was not because of his fighting skills, but because of what he said on the mic. And that's all I was trying to convey on that day was that, look, we're in a new era. And in this new era of MMA, there is an opportunity to do huge, huge things, which Chael's a multimillionaire now. You know, this is how smart Chael is, Miguel. Remember this one, Miguel? Bodog offered, I don't know, it was earlier days of internet, you know, YouTube was kind of still young, and they offered a $10,000 or even a $20,000 bonus to the fighter who got the most internet hits or something like that. Chael, in his hometown, took out billboards, and the billboards cost him about $500 a piece. And he took them out for just the week of the show. And the billboard said, you know, call this number, vote for Chael Sonnen. And he won $20,000 or whatever it was for, you know, $1,000 or $1,500, whatever he spent. And no other fighter thought about doing that. That's how smart and business savvy Chael Sonnen really is. And I think he realized, maybe not in that moment, and I'm not claiming that I had anything to do with Chael's success at all, but it is most certainly not Chael Sonnen in the ring or in the cage that made Chael Sonnen, you're welcome, the Chael Sonnen of today. That's just not the case. You agree with that, right?
I do. But back to the point of the Luke Thomas, Chael Sonnen argument, I think, you know, great is an ethereal word, but I think when it comes down to it, Chael in the ring, you know, I think the best thing I could say about him in the ring is that at his best, he could compete with anyone. And he showed that with Anderson Silva, I think. You know what I mean?
Did. Yes,
so I think in terms of elitism, I think he lost some fights, and I don't know exactly how he would justify that or talk about it. Things happen, but there were times where I felt that he may have lacked a killer instinct earlier on. Some losses and stuff, maybe, you know, he stopped competing at the end too. So I think that there was some question over the way he lost in some of his fights. But like I said, when you take the Anderson Silva fight, you're talking about, you know, a guy who can compete with anybody, and his team and his background. You know, he fought in the Abu Dhabis as well, so they were looking, him and Linland and people, they were interested in learning jiu-jitsu and combating jiu-jitsu. I think that's more what they were aimed at, is combating jiu-jitsu. They were never going to be like, hey, let's put on a gi and learn this stuff and immerse ourselves. That wasn't going to be that team. That wasn't Chael. But Chael definitely was the kind of analyst and smart enough to go and look at jiu-jitsu in depth and understand it. And that's where, you know, you get things that he knew how to do well in MMA. For example, you know, there was very few people in the early days who could posture up in a guy's guard, and Chael had reach, and Chael could at least look like he was hitting you extremely hard. You know what I mean? Because there are guys who hit you in the guard and they're like that, and it doesn't, you know. But Chael had a way Chael had a way of reaching back and throwing the big punch and stuff, and so he knew what he was doing. He's got a 30-17 record, so I don't think you can put him in, you know, like Anderson Silva territory in terms of all time and stuff like that. But this is where I think you can, and I think this becomes an interesting argument across the board in sports. With his salesmanship and with his place where he began doing that in UFC early on, you know, before Conor, you know, he may have been the first bad guy like that. You know, Tank was you know, but he was the first modern guy like that, and his money is because he was that first modern guy, and he drew a lot of attention and stuff. And I think that greatness also brings into mind, you know, where you are as a box office attraction. I think that plays a role in it. I'll give you a good example in the boxing world. Arturo Gatti. Gotti's Hall of Fame credentials in terms of boxing, in-ring work, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. However, if you include box office and the fact that the guy was the biggest boxer on the planet for, a 3-year period, 4-year period, or whatever it was, where, he was just, everybody was watching him and he drew, then you got a Hall of Fame career. You know what I mean? And Chael, I think Chael, because he comes from the 90s and stuff, you saw almost 2 careers with Chael.
You're right.
And
right.
I think when you look at that, at the 2 careers at the competitive end, where he fought, like he said, when he fought Paulo Filho, he came into the UFC, fought Damian Maia, Amar Suluev, those guys weren't no jokes. He fought Trevor Prangley inside the UFC and outside the UFC. He fought Jeremy Horn inside the UFC and outside the UFC. I remember he fought a guy named Terry Martin. He was from your area, Chicago area and stuff. And Terry Martin was a short, squat dude who could really, really punch. And
indeed.
And he stopped Martin. So there were a lot of. He fought Forrest Griffin outside of the UFC. He fought Akihiro Gono. You go back into the early days, the guy was, I think he tried to be a competitor first and he saw the sport languishing, basically. He saw that it didn't really help. And then when he opened his mouth and the explosion came, I think he ran with it. And I think, at that point, when you're talking about his contributions on both ends, I think you're talking about an all-time great. I think you're talking about a guy that if you had to tell me in 2050, if you had to tell people about the top 10 most important fighters of this decade, or the first 20 years of the 21st century in UFC, I think Anderson Silva, Ronda Rousey, Conor McGregor, Chael Sonnen. I think you got to
Tito Ortiz, Royce Gracie, Matt Hughes, Kenny Shamrock, Tank Abbott.
You're taking it out of the era. Just this era, because then you start mentioning some of those guys. But you're talking post 2000, because then you eliminate Ken and Tank and everybody like that. Royce.
Oh, you're talking about after the explosion. Sorry,
I'm talking about 21st century fighters.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, okay, I missed it. Yes, I totally agree with you on that. And let me say this. The Chael Sonnen that he became when he became the American Gangsta is the guy I love. I love everything about that. I think it's fantastic. It's what I want to see. It's the reason that I buy a pay-per-view. Now, I never bought a pay-per-view with Chael, but we won't get into why. But that's a different story. But the thing is that is why people buy pay-per-views. That's all I was trying to say that day. But here's the juxtapose to it. Now when guys try to do it, like Colby Covington, they're starting to kind of look like assholes. And they're getting skipped over. And they start to sound like a broken record. And everybody wants to be Conor McGregor. Well, I've got news for you. Not everybody can be Conor McGregor, and nobody can be the American Gangster except Chael Sonnen. And that's a fact. And so if you want to talk about what somebody did for the sport, I'm not going to argue for a second. You're absolutely right. Chael is in the top 20 of the sport, for sure. For sure. Maybe top 10.
I can tell you this, though. If you
could be top 7.
Now, everybody has a short memory in terms of fights, I think,
Yeah, that's true.
People are talking about, and I'm not just saying Devin, because Devin, is our teammate and he's a younger guy and I appreciate everything he says. But even Devin maybe has a little shred of like Adesanya versus Gastelum is the greatest fight of all time. It just happened this year. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know exactly where that Anderson Silva Chael Sonnen first fight comes in.
It's got to be up there.
But that performance and that loss, that whole story, that whole thing coming off a loss, he made himself a star. That's how big that fight was. That's how compelling that fight was.
Miguel,
and to me, again, you can't. I don't think you can. Adesanya, Gastelum, you're talking about a fight among peers. And with Anderson Silva, Sonnen was already fighting an all-time great. He was already fighting a top 3 all-time great.
Yeah.
And he did what he did. It's still, to me, it's just as bombastic and as out of control and as McGregor's rise. And he did it first, So I think you gotta remember that every story has to have, in the UFC in fighting, you have to have a winner and a loser in terms of what happens in the ring. And the fact is Sonnen also showed us that, if you take a loss, you do live to fight another day. You come back in and, you still talk your game and you still work your shit and you do it. And I think that's important too, because you got to keep in mind, the Anderson Silva fight was a loss, and he still made himself a superstar coming off a loss. So I think you're talking about an absolutely unique individual. And in terms of in-ring stuff, I think you're selling the whole package short. And I think if you're looking at the whole package, I think you're talking about a historic and a great. Yeah, a great for sure.
Miguel, you and I are both guys who have I don't think we're too concerned about proving our masculinity, so to speak. And so you and I have both had conversations wherein we've sat and cried ringside together, watching a fight that was just so compelling and so moving that it was emotionally, it drew everything out of you emotionally. And I've had probably 5 times in my life where I've seen a fight where I literally cried watching the fight because it was so emotionally drawing and draining and it was exclusive to just watching that fight, having that moment be in my life and be there for that. Be there as a part of that moment. And I can't say that I ever had that moment with Chael, but what I can say is this. The second down from that is when you go, I know where that guy came from. I watched him in his first fights. I could go through Cage Rage in the litany of big fighters who came through Cage Rage through my little tiny show before they became great big superstars. And I would watch them fight. And there's a certain space for being proud of that is not braggadocious. It's just simply a matter of, thank God I had some tiny part in that person's life that is getting that shooting star. Thank God I swiped the tail of the comet as it blew through. That's just an amazing sense of everything that is MMA today for me. And I think you would agree with that. And I think Chael perfectly sums up, and I think you perfectly summed up what Chael really means to MMA. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about Frosty, Chael putting himself as one of the greatest fighters of all time. That is, in the ring, I did this, and this. So Frosty, in his response today to Chael's abuse of what Frosty said, which, you may be right. I'm guessing these two will be friends again very soon, but it'll probably take, a fight on the air for them to get to be friends, and Frosty will benefit from this greatly, and so will Chael. Frosty more so than Chael. I hope we benefit from it some. Hit subscribe below.
What do you call him, Frosty?
I call him Frosty because it's like the opening credit says Frosty and it blows across because he's got the gray hair and all of that. Luke Thomas. Sorry,
Right,
Luke Thomas.
I know who you're talking about.
If you look up the Frosty podcast, and you'll find the Luke. Frosty will take you there faster than Luke Thomas.
Here's the deal. I understand Luke Thomas right now is, up there with Helwani and some of the guys, that are
he's not that high, but
that are big MMA, guys that get attention. No one's going to pay attention to our podcast and stuff. But really, I don't much put stock in what any one guy says. And Luke's opinion on Chael can be Luke's opinion on Chael. He's entitled to it. You know what I mean? Chael took a little bit of offense to it, and if I had to weigh it, I think they both have points, and I think, at some point, Chael, I think Chael's right. Trevor Prangley, Jeremy Horn, Paulo Filo, you start talking about competition level, and when you start talking about fighting those guys outside of the UFC, you're talking about a guy who would really show up and fight anywhere. You know what I mean? Because, Road Dogg and Euphoria, we had...
So would Wayne Bogart. Big deal. I know a lot of people who will show up and fight anywhere. I know 1,000 of them. I don't give a shit about that. That doesn't mean anything. I know 1,000 of them. I know 1,000 guys who will show up and fight anywhere.
But every one of those 1,000 would fucking get killed and run over by Paulo Filo. The fact is Chael Sonnen was able to compete with anybody. And there's the difference. Because at some point you start getting into one of those competitions and stuff. But in general, the competition level, look at all the fighters he fought. He looked for hard fights. Even guys like you that you may not remember, like you're looking at his resume. Alex Steibling, nobody.
I know Alex really well.
I know.
I've trained with
I know you would, but nobody's going to remember Alex Steibling now. And if you look at his record, maybe people wouldn't even be that impressed. But at the time that Chael fought him, he was one of the hotter names and one of the bigger guys that was out there. Coming off of his times in Pride and things like that.
Let me just so people know who Alex Steibling is. He trained in Indianapolis, integrated fighting for a while. He wasn't really from around here. He was a Midwest boy, hard wrestler, hard nosed, trained with Chris Lytle, made Chris Lytle. People used to mistake the two when Chris and Alex both fought in the UFC. Alex went to Pride, and this is how you know Alex Steibling. Alex Steibling was the one that after he beat up maybe Heath Herring that night, I forget, he beat somebody up, and he had a shirt on that said, "It's all funny until somebody gets hurt, then it's hilarious." And then that shirt exploded and got really big. So if you remember Pride, that's how you're going to know who Alex Steibling was. Anyways, so look, listen, I'm not trying to argue outside of the ring, and neither was Frosty. He was simply saying, Chael is saying that he's one of the greatest fighters in the world. Is Chael better than Randy Couture? Is he even better than Matt Lindland, for that matter? Come on.
I think you get
Fedor Emelianenko.
No, I think you get to a point where
I mean, you're talking. Look, if you want to talk about the top 10, the top 20, the top 50. Maybe Chael makes the bottom of the top 50.
Well, let's
make it simpler for you. Just in the ring.
Right, let's make it simple for you. How about middleweight?
As a middleweight, that's a completely different argument. Chael as a middleweight is one of the best middleweights in the world. I will agree with that.
And top 10 all time? Despite his record?
Top 20.
Despite his record, you can probably make an argument for top 10 and stuff like that. Now you're talking about a great, There's going to have to be. I think, I don't know. I think that the Chael, you talk about a fight that was an emotional fight. The fact is round 1, round 2, by the start of round 5, I had started to believe that Chael had Anderson's number, And it really, and he managed round 5, and at the end of the day, you get tired, and Silva caught him, and it came near the end of the fight and stuff like that. And that was very, very, very much a blow, like a blow. Like, God, he was so close. You know what I mean? And I think at that moment, that Chael, I would take my chances with him against Matt Lindland, and they were friends, And I think there they also had a little bit of a
wait a minute. Let me interrupt. Are you talking about Matt Lindland at his peak and Chael at his peak, or Matt Lindland at that time and Chael at that time?
Either way. Either way,
Peak to peak.
I think you're talking about comparable guys in terms of several things. One guy's a silver medal Olympian, and I think wrestling has pecking orders and stuff like that. But I don't think Chael looked at Linden's wrestling and said, "Man, I'm out of my league either." I think Chael was a guy who was very confident, always was, in himself and in his physical abilities, to the point where at times he went into fights unprepared. Like fighting a jiu-jitsu guy when you don't know fucking shit about jiu-jitsu is being unprepared. Chael fixed that, and went into the ring more prepared and stuff like that. So, and like I said, I could show you early evolutions where he was really addressing the in-ring stuff. And my only question is I think there's some losses where either, towards the end of the fight, it was like, all right, I've seen enough or something. There's something there that didn't quite satisfy, But aside from that, I think if you're talking about a top 10 all-time middleweight, I think, and I'm not kind to most people. You know what I mean? It's like I don't rate guys overly high, and maybe I'm rating Chael high because I'm giving him more credit than should be given for some of the outside ring. But here's the deal: is at some point, right around where he came along, if he doesn't come in and blow this thing up, we may never have seen other things. McGregor, we may never have seen.
You're absolutely right.
Dana may not have seen Ronda Rousey. Let's go for this women's fighting, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He was the first of those guys, and in that case, I think he's got an all-time place. And then you can show highlights of him. It's not like he's fucking Fred Eddish.
Look, I'm not arguing that Chael's not a great fighter and a total badass.
Okay, so you said great. You didn't say good. You said great.
I did say great.
Okay.
I'm not arguing that he's not a great fighter. I'm not arguing that Chael is not an even better salesman. I'm not arguing that Chael's not an intelligent man. He's articulate. He's quick-witted. He knows exactly what to say, when to say it, how to say it, and what to do to deliver so that he sells tickets next time. So that shows a guy who has abstract thinking other than just, I'm on the microphone. I want to thank my mom and dad and Jesus and my coaches. And Chael never did any of that shit once he started. The moment he said, it's bullshit, I didn't lose, I'm the greatest fighter in the world, I've never lost a round. The moment he became Ric Flair of MMA, I will absolutely say put him in the Hall of Fame. He deserves it. He deserves a top spot in the Hall of Fame. But to try and put Chael in the top 10 or even top 20 of all-time fighters, come on.
That's the argument.
You can't do that. Well, that is the argument. That's what the argument was about. The argument that Chael was trying to make was that he, and this came from him, and then Frosty said, I don't think he's that. And then Chael's retort was, I did this. And then Frosty said, well, let's just go over it. And he pulls out his list, and, through litigation, we find out that maybe Chael exaggerated just a bit. Maybe some of those things that he said weren't quite as true, and some of them were flat out lies, as a matter of fact, if you want to look at it that way. I don't think we need to look at it that way because I don't think it matters.
Yeah, see, if I were Luke Thomas, I would have let the sleeping dog lie. But they're going to get a lot of hits, and that means they're going to get a paycheck from YouTube at the end of the month. So it's all self-serving in that respect. But again, it's a non-argument. Right. Neither guy there is going to decide anything as far as whether he gets in the Hall of Fame or where his rating is or anything like that. So to me, it's a silly argument overall that they're doing, and it's maybe even like I said a little bit of a work there,
Yeah, you might be right. It might be a work.
So we'll see. But I rate Chael pretty highly, and if the Bodog thing had continued, Eventually, it would have been him with the middleweight belt. With Trevor, I didn't want him to fight Trevor again because I just thought it would be a hard slog of a fight. It could be very boring. They've had boring encounters before too, and let Trevor, who was about 6 years older, go on, a run there at the end of his career. The Kondo win was a great win, and and then bring Chael along. That was my plan. So, so be it. Chael did better the path he took. So, more power to him, man.
Yeah, and just to fill in one of the gaps for you on from the beginning of the podcast, we talked about some of the kind of the missing or we're not sure about fights. I'm real sure of those fights because I went to the danger zone all the time because it was in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And that was a guy named Dan Severin. You may have heard of him. I think he fought in the UFC once or twice. May have won a couple of things. Pretty decent wrestler. Well, Dan and I were friends, and so Dan would call me, and he was partners with a woman named Becky Levi, who was also a beast of a fighter. You remember Becky, right?
Sure.
Well, Chael fought for Dan and Becky in the danger zone. They actually had a guy one time fight, and they didn't know it. And this is back when you could wear sweatpants to fight in if you wanted to. And he fought a wrestler, and the wrestler shot a double leg and pulled his leg off because the guy had a prosthetic leg on. And he had worn sweatpants into the ring.
Oh, was that Chael? That's a famous episode, but I didn't realize.
No, that's not Chael. Chael didn't do that.
Oh, okay.
But that happened in the danger zone. And Chael fought in the danger zone. I think Chael actually, on one of his You're Welcome, one of his early ones, he talked to either Dan or Becky. I don't remember who it was, or talked about them. I don't remember exactly what it was. But he was talking to Don Fry, and they talked about the danger zone. And Don was like, oh, yeah, old Dan, man. And they had a really bad connection, so it was a pretty rough one to listen to. But anyway, my point is that Chael started out right here in Indiana, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, at the danger zone because it was illegal in Michigan to do MMA. It was illegal in Illinois. It was illegal in Ohio, and it was illegal in Kentucky. So the only place you could do MMA was Indiana if you wanted to fight anywhere around here outside of Iowa, or I think Tennessee was allowing it. Alabama, there were a few places, but back then things were a lot different. So that's a history podcast we need to do. So anything else, Miguel?
Nope. I had fun talking about Chael. We could probably pick out a bunch of guys like that we could talk about and do a retro on. But yeah, I think Chael, you're talking about a guy who's basically a story of two careers, and I think that he's got a notable place in history. And, I think his in-ring stuff is probably underrated because of his big mouth, even though, he wasn't able to break through against Anderson Silva or Fedor or Jones or, against the real top-notch guys. So, he's a tier below, but I don't put him much below the top tier. I think he could have been, at some point, again, the Chael Sonnen and fought Anderson Silva would have been a handful for anyone. So we can leave it at that. I'm Miguel Iturrate for the CRP. That's Chadillac. He's the boss man. And we wanted to talk Chael Sonnen because we saw these guys going back and forth on there, and they're going to split up a couple of million hits talking about themselves. And we're going to talk about them, and we'll see if we can make 200 hits. We'll see how it goes. Love you all. Bye.
Namaste.